are here live with author Rick Robinson, who has been with Headline Books for a long time through several of his political thrillers that he's written. So he's here to do an awesome presentation with us this evening. So without further ado, go ahead and take it away, Rick.
All right. I need to make sure that everybody steps back from their computers at least 6 feet. This is going to be a social distancing type of seminar we're going to do right here. Todd and Cindy Sue out in California, step back. You're too close. Right there, you're good. Tony Wiki up in Minneapolis, back. Okay. And I think we're all okay now. I think everybody's far enough back from their computers that they could actually get into the program now. Hey, take a look at this, guys. This is where you go to buy books. Buy it now. Now, what we want to talk about, we do want to talk about the journey of writing tonight, because we're sitting at home right now. We have our masks with us. We have all the things that we're doing, but really we're sitting at home. We do have a lot of time right now on our schedule. And we've all sat back and we've said, I always wanted to write a book. Well, now's the time. Now's the time for you to sit back and actually sit down and do the things that it takes to write a book. The only way to do it is to really start. The one thing that I tell everybody, I'm going to give you right now what I do. A lot of times, Kathy Teets, my publisher, will send me around to different writing seminars, and I do a top 10 list. And the one thing that I start with everybody, they come to these seminars, they sit down, they want to know, what do I need to learn to start? Well, you don't need to learn anything to start. You need to actually go in and just start writing. I made a big mistake. Rule number one in my top 10 list, rule number one is don't wait. I got interested in writing when I was 17 years old. A friend of mine, Jack Graham, and I got the chance to go to the Kentucky Education Association. We went to the Teachers Union and went to a meeting where the great Jesse Stewart was going to be the speaker. And I got to be Jesse Stewart's flunky for the day. Jesse Stewart, for those of you who aren't from Kentucky or may not be familiar with this type of literature, was known as the Mountain Laureate of America. His book, The Thread That Runs So True, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. And he wrote about growing up in the mountains, coming of age in the mountains of Eastern Kentucky. And I met him that day, and it was such a great experience for me. Sitting by his side, he gave me a book that day. He gave me the notes to his speech that he gave. Those of you from Northern Kentucky, he gave me the notes from the old Round Towner, later to become the Drawbridge, currently an empty lot in Fort Mitchell. But I knew at that moment I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to write like Jesse Stewart. I wanted to write the great American coming-of-age novel. Problem was I was 17 years old and I hadn't come of age. In fact, I tried probably for 30 years to start that novel that I dreamed of starting when I was back there with Jesse Stewart. That's one of my wife's jokes about me, was that, I was 40 years old, wanted to write a coming of age novel, but I couldn't get past the first chapter because I still hadn't come of age. But I waited, and I waited till the point that I finally went out. We were at a baseball game. I was at a baseball game with a good client of mine, a guy named Tom Salinger, who sat down, and I told him the story that I just told you. And when I talked to Tom, I said, listen up, here's the story. And he looked back at me and he goes, why would you want to write that book? You've got all these stories about being in politics for all your life. Why don't you write some kind of a political thriller? The light bulb went off in my head, and 30 days later, I had about 150 pages of the first novel that I ever wrote, called The Maximum Contribution. Everybody's got one book in them. Don't be like me and don't wait 30 years for it to come out. Start writing today. Now that leads to number two. What do writers do? Well, writers write. Don't sit back and say, well, as soon as this all passes, I'm going to take a session on how to write. I'm going to maybe get deeper into that or get deeper into this. I'm going to figure out how all of this works. No, writers write. That's what we do for a living. If you have a passion right now about putting a story down, putting a story on paper, something that you want to say, that you want to put down, whether it be a journal or whether it be a fiction or whether it be some historical event that you want to write about, writers write. It's what we do. You know, when I get into the mode of actually writing a book, I'll play around with the book for a little while before I get into what I refer to as writing mode. But when I get into writing mode, man, it's like a job. I dedicate at least an hour to it every day, and sometimes that hour turns into 6, 7. There's been times where I've been actually sitting down and sitting in the basement, and I can remember my wife Linda coming down one morning at about 3 o'clock in the morning and going, "Do you know how long you've been in the basement? What is it, noon, 1 o'clock? No, it's 3 in the morning. You got a meeting tomorrow morning." I had been down there since 8 in the morning writing, and so you can get into that zone. Writers write. Don't let any of those things that you have suddenly escape from what is happening in your brain and what is happening, what you want to put down on paper. So, writers write. I want you to start right now, tonight, when we get through with this session, start putting things on page. Just do me one favor only. Don't start with a weather report. Remember the old Snoopy cartoons and Peanuts? It was a dark and stormy night. Whatever you're going to write, don't start with a weather report. We all will know what the weather is going to be like. Start it with something different. Start some other way to do it. Don't start any book with a weather report. Number 3, choose a genre that you're going to write in where you can develop a unique voice. Now, when you're writing and you're going out to all these various different seminars and doing things and you're listening to stuff, people tend to talk about, what does voice mean? And the way to put it easiest, I guess, is that voice is the ability for you to tell a story that no one else can tell. You've got something about you. You know something. You have something deep inside of you that is bubbling up from inside that can take you into that story. And there's nobody else on this earth that could possibly come up with that same story. Now, my voice when I write the political thrillers, my voice is that I try to write my books as an insider. I have 40 years in law and politics. My characters are all from law and politics. And so what I try to do is I try to take that inside information that I've had from all my years playing around in politics and put that into the books, into the characters. When I write a scene from a campaign, something going on in a campaign, I want you to be on that bus. I want you to feel like you're sitting in the back of the bus. You know the candidate is sitting up front, and you can feel the tension in that bus as you're about to make the next stop on the campaign trail. That's the voice that I bring across in those. Now, I also started a second series of novels somewhere along the way. Next week, when I start talking about the different novels that I have, I'll tell the story of how I tricked Kathy Tietz into allowing me to get into the second genre of books. But I also have a genre of books. The books are Alligator Alley and The Promise of Cedar Key, and I'm working on a third one. But I refer to the genre, and I think it's a genre of one. I think I'm the only person that writes in it. And I call it coming of age novels for old guys with gray hair who never came of age. Kind of hard to fit that into a Kindle niche section that you can do. But at the time that I wrote the first one, when I wrote Alligator Alley, that was actually the book that I was thinking about writing back in high school. And it was the story of my great uncle, who had my uncle Chip Thompson, who had gone down to the Everglades to live in the Everglades with the Seminole Indians and would come back occasionally with all these great fishing stories and hunting stories, and Indian fruit from the Indian, and orange fruit from the Indian River, and once even brought back a couple of alligators that got loose on the local golf course and wandered down into Prisoners Lake here in the community. So both of those came from different voices, but both of those came from someplace that I really, really felt inside that I had a story to tell that nobody else on this planet could come up with that voice. And that's what I want you to do as you start writing this thing. I want you to come up with that voice that you have that can tell that story that nobody else can. And whether that's fiction or nonfiction, you know, there's a reason why there are the Doris Kearns Goodwins out there. There are a reason why there are people that write in romance now. They, in whatever genre it is, they bring to them something to the table that grabs your attention because nobody else has spoken to them in that way before. So, number 4, I am going to tell you one thing. One thing you ought to do when you get off this right now, I'm going to give you 2 pieces of advice that were given to me by a couple of the people that mentored me early in the writing process. Rod Pennington was somebody, and Rod Pennington is the king of dialogue. If you read any of his books, you can find them on Amazon. Rod is the king. I mean, the absolute king of dialogue. You want to learn how to move a story through dialogue, read a Rod Pennington book. Rod sat down and through several different essays that he had written and through a couple of things that he had picked up along the way, he went out and made me learn the hero's journey. If you're not familiar with the hero's journey, go watch Star Trek or Star Wars. My kids are going to kill me for that one. Go watch Star Wars. Or go watch any Disney movie. The hero's journey is the journey that goes back to the age of when Homer was writing, of the hero going out into the ordinary world and finding the old mentor that leads them along the way, leading to the first challenge, leading to the second challenge. Most movies you see today, most books you see today, most anything that you'll read or watch has some relationship to the hero's journey. And if you take a look at that, when you start thinking, oh gosh, how am I going to structure this book? The hero's journey is going to help you through that whole process. The other thing that I would tell you to go and take a look at today, I read a book a while back. I was so excited to read this book. To those of you who know me, I'm a huge fan of Irish punk. In fact, if we go too long tonight, I can actually play a couple songs if we go too late tonight. Not that if anybody wants to request that on the chat line or not, but just saying. But the guy who had played the accordion in the Pogues, the people that invented Irish punk, had written a book. And I was so excited to read this book. Couldn't wait to get it. Man, ordered it on Amazon, got it delivered. And he writes in the first chapter that he joined the Pogues at the time that he was trying to write a novel. And what he really wanted to be was a novelist, not really an accordion player for an Irish punk band. Well, as it turns out, he wanted to be a novelist a little too bad. Every page I had to stop and take a look 3 or 4 times at a dictionary to figure out what the words he was using, what they meant. I had to stop, figure out the content. It really was difficult to get through the book. I mean, I wanted to get through it because I wanted to know his stories about being on the road with Shane MacGowan and the Pogues, opening up for Bob Dylan, doing the type of things that he had done, but it was really difficult by the language he used. So the second thing that I would recommend while you're doing all this stuff, while you're sitting at home, while you're doing this initial writing, go and pick up a copy of The Elements of Style. The Elements of Style is the book, the Bible on how to write in a very deep, but yet somewhat pedestrian way, in a manner that will bring out what your thoughts are, but do it in such a way where you're not sending everybody to a dictionary every 5 minutes to try and figure out what it is that you're looking for. Now, I've got you to that point where you're ready to write. You're starting to write some stuff down. I get asked this question all the time. And the question is, where can I pick up your books? And if you look right there, you can look at that and dial that, and you can, well, that's actually not the question I get asked all the time. But if you wanted to, that would be where you would go right now to find all that. So not that it's a shameless plug or anything. But I always get asked the question, should I outline my story or should I just write my story? And I will tell you that there really isn't any way that is right and any way that is wrong. I have a friend of mine who outlines everything to such a degree, I mean, such a broad degree that everything is written down on 8.5 by 11 cards. By the time he gets done with doing all of the work that he has done on outlining, his living room looks like one of those domino effect theories where you can suddenly flip through, and all he has to do is start flipping through and following what started out as just a simple outline. I tried to do that when I wrote the book Writ of Mandamus. And Writ of Mandamus is one of my favorite books because it takes place in one of my favorite places, and that is Ireland. And I had this outline of this wonderful, brilliant chase scene that would start in County Cork, at a horse farm in County Cork, wander its way all through Ireland, get on the barge, go over into England, and the chase scene would end up in the place where my grandmother's family was from, Ashton-under-Lyne. Brilliant. Had it all paste by paste by paste by paste, had it all outlined. I started writing the scene, and by the time the car that was being chased reached the first stop sign, everybody was killing each other. My attempt at trying to outline was a complete and total failure. I found for me is that when I get into the head of a character or let the character get into my head, is that when the story starts progressing, they seem to take over the scene for me. The chapter becomes theirs. Every time that I try and plan that Jane, with the CIA, is going to turn to her right to clear the room, something on her left certainly grabs her attention. And that's what happened in the scene. I mean, I had this brilliant chase scene, of people even nonchalantly walking around the barge as they make their way over into England. But it never came to pass because by the time, again, they got to the first stoplight, everybody started shooting it out. So there is no way that is right and there is no way that is wrong. I will tell you personally that every time that I've written a book, I know where I want to start, I know where I want to end, and somewhere in between there is the story. Now, I did get in trouble with that one time. This week we offered, Headline Books was kind enough to offer online a free Kindle copy of Manifest Destiny. That was the book that I would always tell people that's where I became a writer. I had written book 1 and book 2. I had written the book that started the Richard Thompson series, that was The Maximum Contribution. I had followed that up with Sniper Bid, and then Sniper Bid got named one of the top 5 books, independent books of the year by Book News magazine. So I thought, well, maybe I ought to figure out a little bit about writing. Maybe this ought to be something that I ought to take a little more seriously. And I did, and I got deep into a plot. And this plot was taking place in Romania, and I had weaved this plot so heavily together that suddenly I couldn't figure out how to get out of it. And the writing and the characters and the stories. And the first time that I wrote it, first time that I finished it way too quickly because I was just confused with the characters and I wanted them to get out of it. And I can remember my wife reading it. My wife, Linda, is my best critic on this, reading it and going, yeah, you need about 3 more chapters to get from here to here because nothing whatsoever is working because none of the characters would have ever done that. They never would have done that in anything that they did. So outline, freestyle, There is no difference between the two. There is no right way. If you think by taking your story and outlining it piece by piece by piece is going to help you write it, that's the right way to do it. If you think knowing where the beginning is and the ending is, and in between the story happens, that's the right way to do it. There is no right way. It's what individually moves you to put those words down on paper. Here's the tough thing. Here's one of the tough ones. Number 6, learn how to move a story through dialogue and learn where the narrative is important to move the story. So what I mean by that is that so many times you read a book and somebody wants to write the fiction all in third person. They want to write it all as if they're the omnipotent voice coming down and telling you what is happening. But what people really want to read and people would really want to hear is the dialogue, the exchange back and forth between people that normally happens in everyday life, even in the days of quarantine where we're talking over Zoom about books. People want to hear the dialogue. People want to hear the discussion. People want to hear people talking back and forth about it. So you have to be able to figure out how you're going to get from point A to point B, maybe not by saying, and then he looked down and saw that this happened. Maybe it's about he said, she said, getting to that point. That's going to excite a reader far much more than the narrative. But you also got to figure out where the narrative works in. You know, the narrative works in very important places to be able to describe what is happening. And one of the things that I tell people, especially when they're looking about the narrative, is when you write the narrative, write with all your senses. Don't just write with what you're seeing or hearing, but write with what you're feeling, smelling, everything, tasting. One of the scenes that one of my favorite scenes from writing is actually in my first book, The Maximum Contribution. And it comes from a day when my wife Linda and I were hanging out in Key West, and I got up early to take a walk. There had been a storm the night before. And there's nothing like being on an island the morning after a storm because everything smells so clean, so fresh. The palms are still laying in the street from the wind that came down, and the smell was just remarkably fresh. And I remember walking by an old woman's house, and she was sitting on her front porch with one of those little vapor fans that comes down and, you know, brings the air and the vapor that comes out. And she was hand squeezing some orange juice. And the orange was getting caught in that vapor and coming down. And that clean smell was suddenly being overcome by the fresh smell of this woman squeezing this orange. And back in the background, as you could only find in Key West, a rooster was crowing. And all of that just so took over all my senses. The feeling of being out and the humidity starting to rise on the skin, the clean smell, the everything. You know, those are the type of things in a narrative that when you're talking, you don't want to talk with just what you see. You want to talk with all of your senses and all of what you're doing. By the way, did I say to go here to buy my books? I may have left that out earlier, but headlinebooks.com, that's the place you go. You want to get that early copy of the Maximum Contribution, right there is where you go. You know, the other thing that you get about when you talk about the dialogue and you talk about the narrative, and I get a lot of questions about this when I go to seminars. The question I get is first person, third person, active or passive? And that's really hard based upon what it is that you're doing. First and third, I wouldn't ever get more into early writing. I would never get more into one or two voices that you're using there. You know, maybe you use a first here, maybe you use a third there. What I've basically done is, personally, is that all of my political thrillers are third person. all of my coming of age for old guys that never came of age are first person. That way I'm able to keep the two of those distinct. I'm able to keep them together. I'm able to keep them happening through a separation that is, I guess, in my own brain more than anything else, but also for the reader. When the reader picks up and they start hearing this first person story, they know they're not going to be reading one of my political thrillers. And I think that's one of the things that you can take a look at when you're doing that. The other thing when you take a look at it is I'm very much about, and this my friend Steve Smith, if he's listening tonight, Steve Smith, beat this into my head, was that, you've got to go to active voice. Everything that you're doing when you're talking, when you're using the verbs, especially in the narrative, not he had run to the store, he's running to the store. Not she had, keep your verbs active, keep the pace of the story going by using active words, active language, active situation, things that actually keep the reader's attention, that keep you together in a position, that keep people interested in the development of the story itself. Let's see what we got up here next. Number 8. Oh, this is actually my favorite. This is my favorite one, all of them. Be a masochist. Take your characters and be an absolute sadomasochist. Be as mean to them as you possibly can. You're going to find what your characters are made of in fiction by the situations you put them in and how they get out of them. When I wrote Writ of Mandamus, which is, again, on the political side, my favorite book of all of the books, pick it up there. But if you read that, you're going to see I developed this really cool character based upon a guy that I knew when I was practicing law, when I was back as a young kid, first out of law school, practicing law. It was a guy who had this long beard. He wore fuzzy pink slippers to court. He did all these things. But man, when I developed him and put him in the book, I was mean to him. I don't want to give away the story, but I was damn horrible to him. But it adds to the character that he shows throughout the book. In that same book, I could remember at one point, one of the characters actually, and again, I don't want to give away too much, but the main character's wife is looking down the barrel of a gun. And when one of my readers, who was a state representative from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, got to that point and the chapter ended and I immediately went to somewhere else in the book, he picked up the phone and called me, angry that I was about to kill her off. I said, "Oh, no, don't worry, keep reading. You'll see what happens there. There's something a little bit different than what you're doing." But it's that ability to put them through a situation that maybe even you couldn't deal with yourself. That's what you want. That's what you want to do to your characters, because that's what the people want to read about. That's what's going to show what they're made of. That's going to show the type of person they are in your book. Research. And now I say that from the standpoint of books are not historical, not all fiction is historical fiction. Okay, kind of keep that in mind. But if you're going to say something historical, make sure it's accurate. I took one of my kids one time to the Thriller Fest. This was an annual gathering of thriller writers in New York. Wonderful conference. If you write thrillers, I don't think they're going to likely have it this year, but next time that they have it, it's worth going to, because you meet a lot of your heroes. I mean, I got to sit with Harlan Coben. I got to sit with all these different people and sit around and talk writing. It's a wonderful conference to go to. But I was on a panel with a guy, and he did a reading from one of his books. And he talks about how the chief of staff to the president of the United States left the Roosevelt room, ran up the stairs to the Oval Office to tell the president. Now, for anybody that knows politics, the Oval Office is here and the Roosevelt room is here. They're next door to each other. If you ran, you might trip over something. It's 2 steps. And I remember when that panel was done, my son looked at me and said, Dad, that was just, I can't believe he read that. I mean, he knew enough about the White House that, you know, he knew they were right next to each other. And his comment to me was, I'd never read his book just because of that one thing. So when you do, sometimes it may be just 1 line, it may be 2 lines. You may do a couple of hours of research just for those 1 or 2 lines when you're writing fiction. And a good reason why Doris, Kearns Goodwin only writes 1 book every 5 years. It takes that much to come up with 1 line, just 1 or 2 lines of the historical accuracy for that book. And that's one of the things that I think is very important, that when you're going to put the historical part in it, you have to be accurate. Every book that I've written on the political side has some basis in fact. And that's the fun part of being a fiction writer, is that I take the factual part that I know is really, 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 really true, and then I build another story around it. So I may take the fact that in Manifest Destiny, back in the War of 1812, the mace, which is the great symbol of the House of Representatives, was stolen during the War of 1812. Never found. Probably on one of the boats that sank on its way back to England following the War of 1812. Or for a fiction writer, maybe it's not. Maybe it's somewhere else, and maybe there are clues as to where it is. So that's the type of thing. I have the historical part where I have the real part of the story. I have the fiction part that I add on the other side that makes it right. But you got to make sure when you do that, the fiction side is complete. Finally, the number 10 here, and then we'll get into a couple questions that I've had earlier. As you start doing this, find some good readers. When I first started writing, from the time that I was 17, I started writing. But I wouldn't share it with anybody because I never had the faith in myself that it was good enough to be published. Years later, I would write things and I would send them to my friend Kevin Kelly, the artist, who you actually see the picture over my shoulder here of Blonde Bombshell. That's a Kevin Kelly painting. I would take things, I would write them, I would send them to Kevin Kelly. He would tell me how wonderful they are. I would immediately tear them up and throw them away. I didn't have the courage to actually go forward and see if they were good enough. Have some people read your stuff, because people read it. I tell people, if you really want to know how good of a writer you are, write a 70, 80,000 word novel, and then get the women at the local church in their book club where they're out drinking wine and reading books and talking about books. Get them to go through and give their opinion of it. Man, you'll find out real quick how good of a writer you are, because they will rip you to shreds and they will tell you where it's coming. My wife actually is one of the people that I really, really depend on to take a look at my books and tell me where they're good and where they're bad. And she taught me to do something very, very important. We were talking a minute ago about how to where to put the narrative and where to put the dialogue. She actually taught me how to combine the two. My wife is a very avid reader. When Barnes and Noble would, when she would get a cold, Barnes and Noble would send her a card, get better. The thing that she taught me through the various stuff she had read was that a lot of times you put into your characters the idea that, well, maybe what they're thinking of, the reader already knows that. He said with a stern voice. Well, he reader obviously knows my eyes are squinting and I'm pointing at the other character. No, they don't. They don't have a clue. So she was able to get me by some of the books that she had read. She gave them to me. She sat me down. She made me read them. And I would say Janet Ivanovich is very good at this, for instance, at how to do this, is that taking the situation of the thriller component and, you know, he gritted his teeth. He furrowed his lip. He drew his fist back. The type of things that you think in your mind the reader's already seeing, the reader isn't seeing. You've got to put that in there. And that's one of the things that having a good group of sample readers is an absolute essential to when you get to the point that you finally want to do this. So let's get through this again. We want you to not wait. Start tonight. Writers Write. That's what we do. Choose a genre where you can develop a very unique voice. Read The Elements of Style and The Hero's Journey. If you email Rod Pennington, he'll send it to you. Outline versus freestyle. There is no right way. Learn how to move the story through dialogue and learn when and how to paint a picture with narrative. Use all your senses. First person versus third person. Passive language versus active language. I really like everything to be active. Be cruel to your characters, just mean as you can be to them. Research, 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 and then find some good readers. And with that, you'll be on your way to their first step in writing. Now, I think we have a few questions. I know
We
Todd
do.
and Cindy Sue. Are you there, Ashley?
Yes.
I hear the voice of Ashley, the voice of angels coming upon us.
That's exactly right. I am here, Rick. We do have.
Okay, you're on. Do I have to put my mask on now?
Yes, you're too close to me, and I have to be this close so I can read my screen. So I'm going to need you to back up, please.
Okay, I'm sorry. There we go. Is that good?
That is much better. I feel much more secure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Safety first, friends. Safety first. So our first question is from Todd and Cindy Sue. They would like to know your thoughts on publishing today.
Todd and Cindy Sue, two of my very dear friends from out in California, who are putting together a couple of books and are looking at trying to get them published, and had a couple questions. I know they wanted to talk about what the publishing process entailed. Now, when I first got started, the writer's book that contained all the publishers was about that thick. Now it's about that thick, because there are so many different ways that someone can go and get published today. You can self-publish on Kindle. You can find an indie publisher. You can go to one of the big book publishers. I think the first question that you have to answer when you're looking at one of these situations is, what do you want from your book? What do you want from your writing? When I first started the Maximum Contribution, the only thing that I really wanted was to say that I had written that book that I'd always talked about wanting to write. As it turned out, I took the writer's guide, which again was that thick at the time. I narrowed it down to 30 different publishers and came up with 3 who wanted my book. I ended up with Headline Books because Kathy Teets had someone who was very familiar with the political process and wanted to get the book out in time for the coming election. And I thought, there's somebody who understands what I was trying to say. So I went with, at that point, an independent publisher without an agent, and never considered the idea of going out and doing anything on Kindle, on Amazon. Now, the reason I never thought about doing anything on Kindle, there wasn't one. There wasn't any such thing as Kindle. In fact, I can remember I had a national television show appearance on Fox News, and Kathy and I scrambled the day that it happened because we thought maybe we ought to upload this book onto this Kindle thing that was happening, because maybe we could sell some books on this Kindle thing. with this national news coverage. I became popular with a lot of readers because I was picked up by a chain of uh, bookstores that operated out of airports. And for, gosh, a year, you could walk into any airport bookstore and you would see my first three books were in the front rows. I went back to those same bookstores a year later and their book sales were down 400, 500% because Kindle would come along. So the question you need to ask yourself is, what do you want out of this book? Is this something that you're going to be taking and doing on a just as needed basis to give it out? I have a friend of mine who all he wanted to do was tell the story of a race car driver, John Lucas, who wrote this great book about a race car driver named Stan Bowman from Northern Kentucky. That's all he wanted to do. He went the route of Kindle self-publishing. And of course, of all the people that I've talked to and all the people that I've worked with over the years, I'm writing the book, he's the guy that got the movie deal. You know, he ended up getting a movie deal where they have made the legend of Stan Bowman into a documentary. And he's working on his second book and his second documentary. So I also remind people, sometimes people look at it, I have people kind of look at me and sometimes my way has been, and the best way that I have done has been through Headline Books. I've loved my, you hear people complaining about their publisher. I love my publisher. I love the people that I work with at Headline Books. I would highly recommend you going online, taking a look at the submission indications that are there. Send your submission to Kathy. She'll take a look at it. She'll tell you whether it's the type of book she's looking to publish or not. And those are the type of things that I think you really need to think about when you're looking to publish a book. And those are the things, got to answer those questions first. Do you just want to get a story out, or do you want to be on the New York Times bestseller list? Two very different paths that you're going to go about. I went on the path that was somewhat in the middle of that.
Excellent. Steve Kramer would like to know how to take real live facts and put them into fiction.
Steve is a good friend of mine. Steve is a dear friend of mine from here in Northern Kentucky and is looking at writing a book. And I think what you need to do when it's kind of like the books that I have, is that I take something that is factual and then I weave the rest of the story of fiction around it. So the factual section of let's say Sniper Bid was that Sniper Bid occurred in the middle of the steroid epidemic in Major League Baseball, and hearings were going on. I happened to be writing a lot of op-ed pieces at the time, and I wrapped the book around what was really happening in Washington and what was really happening with the legislation that they were trying to pass in Washington about the steroid epidemic. The rest of it, that's the great thing about being a fiction writer. It's all just made up. But you have to get the research right on the front end to make sure that you know what you're talking about. I ended up doing a lot of research in that book on how steroids work, how steroids are detected, how baseball players and actually all athletes stay ahead of the testing protocols, and how it all works in the slimy underworld of and performance enhancing drugs. Once I knew all that, writing the story became a lot easier. And I changed all the names, of course, to hide the real bad guys. But if you read that book, you'll know who I'm talking about. I may not raise the names of the people that were involved in the steroid scandal of supplying the steroids to Major League Baseball. But if you read between the lines, you'll know who I'm talking about. Those who are sports fans, anyway.
Excellent. We have one more question from the Facebook feed. This is from Will Davis. He says, thoughts on...
Hey, Will.
Yeah, Will. Thanks for joining, Will. He says, thoughts on one point of view in first person and another in third.
Again, we talked about that a little bit. I'll tell you what I would suggest you read is, I think there's two issues that you have to deal with here. One issue is just dealing with keeping the two separate. And what I did, for instance, in Alligator Alley was that the first person portion of the book is the old guy with gray hair as he's living today, as he's living in the moment. He's talking about that happening right now. Uh, and the third person that I used in that book is this omnipotent voice remembering his childhood. So there's these two things that are happening in the book. There's these flashbacks that are happening. I use those as third person. Then we take and I use the first person as what's happening in the current situation. Now, the thing that you run into, Will, I think the problem that you run into in that type of a writing where you're mixing the two is making sure you keep the pacing correct. It can tend to slow down when you go to the third person. And now the guy I think who is the person who is the best person at writing in pacing any book is Harlan Coben. Harlan Coben is the master of the thriller, where I write thrillers about big picture issues about the world's going to end if something doesn't happen in a particular situation. The vice president is killed, this person is killed. Harlan's books are more along the lines of something's happening to this family, something's happening to this person. They're very small issue, but they're brilliant in the way they're written and brilliant in the way they're paced. So the one thing that I would say to do after you read Alligator Alley that you can actually pick up here at a copy at Headline Books at that phone number right there is that I would also suggest you get a copy of a book by Harlan Coben called Tell No One. Because when it comes to thriller writers, the Bible for pacing is Tell No One. It's an absolutely, I'll tell you how good the book is. And I told this to Harlan in one of the thriller writer conferences one day. I had driven back and forth between here and Washington, D.C. more times than I could possibly imagine. But I got a copy of Tell No One on tape, and I put it in the car, started listening to it. Finally, I've got to go to the bathroom. I get off on the exit and suddenly realize I have no idea where I am. I've driven 45 minutes to an hour past the exit where I was supposed to get off. The book is that darn good. The pacing of it, the bring you up to this point, bring you back down, bring you up to this point, bring you back down. That's how, and I think when you're looking at first and third person and you're switching back and forth, that's the key that you have to remember. That's the thing that you have to watch out for and make sure you follow, that you pace yourself just right.
That's excellent advice. We do have one more question from a classy lady named Linda Robinson. She would like to know, so are you basically saying that your success as a writer is due to the brilliance of your wife?
Absolutely. I have to tell you, this is a true story. True story. When I decided to write the initial book, and Kathy will remember, your mom will remember this story very well, is that I wrote down all this book. I put it in a paper, and the idea that I was going to do is that I was going to do a Pat Conroy. You know, when people talk about self-publishing, Pat Conroy actually published his first book, not only published it, but printed it, took it to a printer, took it to a binder, took around it in his trunk and sold it to bookstores locally. I was going to write this book called The Maximum Contribution. I was going to make maybe 100 copies from a client of mine who was a binder and make all my friends suffer through it as a Christmas present. My wife, who reads everything, I told you that, my wife who reads everything, I gave it to her and I handed it to her. I said, read this book, tell me what you think. And she came back and gave me the ultimate wife's compliment. She said, this isn't half bad. And she said, I bet if we worked on it, we could find a publisher. And nobody's going to, read any of my stuff. And she actually took the pen to paper and started doing some of the things we talked about here, some of the lessons that I learned early on in this. And she went forward and took this stuff. And that's how I ended up finding Kathy Teets. In fact, I was at a Holiday Inn actually doing my pitch to my future publisher. There was some 16-year-old kid that was at a race at some sort of a meet that she was running.
It was a big deal, Rick.
It was like the West Virginia cross country championships or something. And
it was track. It was the state track meet, and it was a big deal.
And she kept interrupting me as I was trying to sell my book to her mother. She kept interrupting us because she wanted to go to McDonald's and get a McMuffin or something like that. And here I am trying to sell, so proud of my first piece of work. And then there's there's this kid that keeps bugging her mom for money. But yes, the answer to your question is yes. Everything that I put on paper, nothing gets out of this house until Linda Robinson approves it.
Well, so far so good, if you ask me. And see, if it wasn't for that, we would have never met. Well, that's all the questions that we have in the chat. Again, we have been chatting with Rick Robinson, Independent Author of the Year, and we are offering free shipping on all orders of Rick's books. Are you going to end us with a song, Rick?
No, I'm not going to end it with a song because my wife is downstairs, who I says nothing gets out of the house unless she allows. I hear her downstairs say, no, no, no. But Dennis and I may actually stay online and play a couple tunes together as we for this when we get finished. We may have band practice. Dennis and I are in a band called Phil's Five and Dime, which actually plays a little bit of Irish punk every now and then whenever we can get together and share some Jamesons and Guinness together. But yeah, if you get a chance, truthfully, if you're looking to plug your book, if you're looking for a good publisher, if you're looking for somebody, Headline Books is the place to go. Also, if you're looking to buy anything by Rick Robinson and Dennis Hetzel, hey, right here is the place to go, baby. It's the place to be. Thank you very much. It's good being with you, Ashley. Good being with you, Kathy. Dennis, always a pleasure, pal.
Thanks so much, guys.